Hello, my darlings. Madam Raven here with a wonderful steampunk fantasy for you, entitled The Elf by Dentonius. Wood exploded, and she was covered in dust and splinters as she ran. Cannons? They're using cannons for a single elf? She muttered to herself as she ran deeper into the forest. She felt the rhythmic pounding behind her, and she realized it wasn't the cannons on the wall of Draspire. And she realized it wasn't the cannons on the wall of Draspire that were firing at her, but their lone automata was hunting her. She increased her pace. It was easily twice her height at around 9 feet tall. A cannon on the left arm held on 5 shots launched by alchemy. The right arm was a rotating broadsword on a multiple-jointed arm, and all its workings were encased in armor 1/4 of an inch thick. They'd even given this on a head loaded with different forms of sensors. She stood and marveled on it at her arrival, and now 3 days later she was running from the great machine. She braced herself against a tree, panting, ragged breaths to draw in air for the next sprint. "Why did I have to live with humans?" she gasped at no one. She remembered how easy life was in the elf settlement. Most elves are natural kleptomaniacs, and this was taken in everyone's stride. Possession was transitory. 1 minute you had a gold pocket watch, the next a silver. No one cared as long as you had the item you needed on your person. If you didn't, you just asked and 1 or 2 would appear, generally on your own. But she wanted adventure. She wanted to see the world. Now she was seeing the receiving end of an automaton's cannon. She set off again, heading for Delorance and Inspector Brunel. He was a no-entity. He would protect her. Also, the papers she had stolen mentioned him directly as a threat to some alchemist in the city. Another tree erupted into splinters, and the pounding of the automata's feet were more prominent. As she ran, she calculated 1 mile left of woodland, then another mile of open plain. She would not survive that mile in the open to Delorance, even using craters as cover. She changed direction. Her and her 2 accomplices on this adventure had stashed some weapons in the forest. She just had to find the markers. Changing direction from west to south, she began a circle of the wood, looking for a small mark left on the odd tree from between her small town and Draspire. A tree exploded in front of her. She skidded down to the ground, splinters showered, and a chunk of tree landed inches from her nose. She opened her eyes and saw the mark, 300 yards south of the detonated tree. The light was fading further within the forest. That would only help the automata. It saw in heat, not light. She stood, and wood scattered to the ground, and ran once more, ducking under branches and around undergrowth. A tree toppled behind her as the automata chasing her crashed through it. "I hope you're dented," she shouted back, and then regretted it as it would tell it where she was. She stopped at the weapons cache and dropped to her knees. She wasn't the first to reach it. Beaten and bloody, her brother lay on the floor. He'd been with her just before she'd taken the papers. In his hand was a single vial of green liquid. It must have come from the same alchemist as well. She moved over, her imminent threat forgotten, tears running freely. Brushing a lock of hair from his face, she looked down at what could have been a peaceful form, except for all the blood. He'd had the same idea: get to the weapons, remove pursuers, and get the evidence to Delorance. She collected the vial and read the label. Revenant. That didn't sound good. Revenants were a plague dead with their own purpose of destruction. His swollen cheek moved. For a moment she felt hope he was alive. Then she realized it was caused by the automata's pounding towards her. She ducked down and kissed his cheek. Wiping the remaining tears away, she reached for the weapon's stash. She flipped the lid and looked in. Both the rifle and the pistols were missing. A single knife, an elvish longbow with quiver remained. Reaching in, she tucked the knife into her belt, swung the quiver over her shoulder, and grabbed the longbow. She looked at its size. Most humans called them short bows because of its size, but it was a longbow to her. The arrows were standard blades. They would not penetrate the automata's shell, but they might take out the sensors. She cast her eyes at her forever sleeping brother once more, and left, looking for an easy vantage point to take her first shot. She could hear the crashing and pounding getting closer. She sprinted and jumped. Reaching up, she grabbed a branch and swung herself up. She would now be at head height with it. Higher, she wanted to be higher. Looking from her chosen branch, she could see the next would have been a better choice. She inched along the branch, her slender feet balancing precariously on the smooth bark. Reaching up, she couldn't quite reach the branch on the next tree. Her weight had bowed her standing point. The automata's profile caught her attention. It had appeared in her peripheral vision. She flexed her knees and jumped. She reached the higher, thicker branch as the glowing orbs of the automaton turned her direction. It moved forward slowly now. It could see its prey. Cannon raised, aiming at her as it thundered forward. She balanced on the branch, grasping the bow in her left hand, her right drawing an arrow from the quiver. She focused on her target, controlling her breathing. The bow had always been hers. She knew its power. The arrow notched without looking.
"Calm down and face judgment,"
the voice boomed from the automata. In a second, she snatched the bow straight, drew, and released. She didn't watch the arrow's flight, but fell back to the ground. Metal hit glass with a sudden crash. The automata readjusted its feet, and the cannon fired. The branch where she had sat exploded over her head as she rolled forward. She was closer to the automaton now. Glancing up, she could see the arrow's shaft protruding. She scuttled past the mechanical hunter and headed back toward Delarance. She had a few moments' lead, but soon the pounding steps of the automata were following her. She glanced back at her brother as she ran past once more. She prayed to the above lords that their friend was still alive. The quiver bounced against her back, but she had no time to tighten the strap. The automaton was closing fast. She must have missed the ocular sensor. She stopped, tired of running, and drew the bow once more. There had to be a weakness. There was always a weakness in machines. She braced herself, arrow notched, bow held high, arrow ready to be drawn. The automata was running, metal feet pounding and crushing all beneath. The dappled light reflected on the bronze armor like fire. The arrow's shaft still protruded from the head. A sensor had been destroyed, but which one she had no idea. It didn't bother to slow down. It came charging head on, planning on running her down and crushing her under its weight. She drew the arrow back and loosed, the flight straight towards the head once more. Another broken glass, but it still charged forward. Without aiming, she drew and loosed 3 more arrows in quick succession. One skittered across the metal chest. One dangled on something under the right arm, causing it to flail and the blade to catch onto a tree. The automaton spun from being pulled off balance, and the third arrow missed completely. It braced its feet and held the cannon arm out to balance. The cannon, she whispered to herself. How many shots had it fired? 4, she guessed. There would be 1 shell left loaded in the breech. The weak point was its own weapons, as with the oversized blade embedded in the tree stopping pursuit. The explosive in the cannon could destroy the automaton from within. She drew another arrow and moved slowly, sidestepping. She moved to look directly down the cannon. She doubted that anyone has willingly stood in front of the barrel. The arm was perfectly balanced as the automaton pulled the blade free from the tree, taking measured step as if unsheathing it from the wood. She took a breath, held it, and released the arrow. She watched as it streamed forward and disappeared into the darkness of the barrel, fletching and all. It seemed like an age before anything happened. Looking at the barrel, nothing but darkness within, she began to draw a second arrow.
Judgment is past. Termination.
The automaton boomed. She looked up and realized the automaton had been judging her while she stared at the barrel. An orange glow began to swell as it braced its legs once more to fire. From the back of the cannon, the exhaust flames ejected, but not shell released. Bringing the bow to bear once more, she fired into the cannon. It was primed. The other arrow had lodged in its place, and now the second shot detonated it. Just before the explosion, she swore she saw the ocular lights glow brighter for a moment, as if in shock. Then the machine exploded from the chain reaction, starting at the barrel and going through to the alchemical engine that powered it. The blast knocked her from her feet, sending her flying through the underbrush. Thorns and branches ripped at her hair and clothing as she was forced through to the ground. It was full night by the time she moved again. Dragging herself free of the undergrowth, she found the partial remains of her adversary. Black smoke filled the sky from small fires. Parts of the machine were scattered around, embedded in trees and in the ground. Half of the head remained, a single charred arrow protruding from the wreckage. She looked around. People would be on their way to investigate. Guards to continue the chase, and scavengers after the metal. She looped the bow over her shoulder, checked the papers and vial were still in her pocket, and moved off, heading towards Delarance. Her brother's death would not be in vain. If she got to Inspector Brunel and saved his life, then they did the right thing. It would not bring her brother back or her lost friend, but it would be a start. Exhaustion and grief hit her. The tears fell freely as she trudged on towards her destination, aware that with the death of her brother, she would not be going home ever again. So quoth this raven. My darlings, if you enjoyed this, please like, subscribe, share, and if you leave a comment, I promise I'll reply.